No, I've already read it. It's making me too upset as it is.
Oh, all right, I won't.
Only read to me if the federal government has finished negotiating on a funding package for the schools.
I could read about like recipes or something. Stream Taylor Swift's new album, Folklore.
I was going to
Swift's
say,
8th studio album.
Sing us a song to start.
Okay, guys.
It's actually quite cozy.
We're
Taylor
live
Swift's
on live
album.
stream now.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So we won't talk about Taylor Swift's album. Very good. And instead, if everybody is here, we can call the meeting to order.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Fix the problem.
Okay. Are we ready to get started?
Mm-hmm.
Then let's get started.
Madam Chair, thanks for having us join. Last night was very productive. I appreciate you letting me participate and listen in. Dr. Estrella, is there anything that you'd like to share before we jump back in?
So thank you, Dr. Bosa. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our second board retreat. Madam Chair, thank you for allowing us to have this opportunity today. I'm looking forward to really productive conversations that would lead to streamlining communication across our system, particularly amongst the governance team. So again, thank you, and I look forward to a very productive dialogue amongst all of us today.
For sure.
You good? All right. We are recording, which will allow staff to go back and take notes as the board begins to communicate some priorities, some thoughts, some ideas, some things that are high priority, and we'll be able to go back and bring those to you. As we all know, communication is important in any relationship, whether it's personal relationship or work relationship. And the more clear we are about the way we communicate and the rules of the game, as Dr. Gorman mentioned yesterday, the better off we are as a group and the better opportunity we have to not only police ourselves, but really think about how we're working as a team. It's my understanding that Superintendent had provided in early July what I would refer to as a sort of draft communication plan that outlines a variety of different ideas and thoughts about how things are working. Part of this, the best practice really is about developing a formal communication plan. The board as a team, as a governance group, needs to be able to approve that and say, yes, we agree with essentially what we've decided to in terms of how we're going to communicate, and then guiding the individuals in the governance team by using this. And the important part is that everybody participates. So it's superintendent's responsibility to keep the board members abreast of issues. I used to have an old saying, because in Florida, the grocery store is called Publix, and we called it the Publix Rule, which is a school board member should never be out shopping and be accosted by somebody and told something about something that had happened at a school and not having heard it from someone on the staff. Does that make sense? And the same way, if there's an issue or concern that you hear about in the field, it's important that the superintendent know and not get caught flat-footed as well. And part of that, we're going to walk through today a variety of strategies that we've developed over the years and our best practices. And so that's really where we are with that. Can you guys see? Let me go ahead and share that now. And please let me know if you can see it with the thumbs up. Okay, so as I was mentioning, this is the draft proposal. If I don't know that it's big enough to read it on your side. Madam Chair, is it big enough for you to read, or is it too small?
I can grab my glasses.
I can't see it at all on the.
All right.
On the
So
left
let me
hand.
go ahead.
Did you share the?
Just for the,
Yeah.
I can't. Verbal.
Just for the sake of the group, I'll give a quick overview. and we will make sure that you have this draft as well. So essentially, the superintendent will initiate individual contact with board members on a regular basis. However, the board members are encouraged to call the superintendent when issues or concerns arise. Board members should feel free to call staff members to ask clarifying questions if agreed that the board members have conversations with staff, and staff members will share the information with the superintendent. At this point, it's typically best practice that in the beginning, when you have a new superintendent, in this case, Dr. Estrella, is that those issues go to her. She needs to be able to, in the first 60, 90, 120 days, get a quick sense of the issues and concerns that are coming up. Now, of course, with COVID-19, those issues may be significantly amplified at this point. But in order for her to transition in smoothly in the role, in the beginning, it's really important that those issues and concerns go through the superintendent. If a board member requests significant data or reports, the superintendent will review the request and determine the amount of work that's needed to complete the request. If the request is granted and completed, that information should be shared with the entire board. How do you guys feel about that? Let's have a quick wrap around that. So if information is requested by one board member, we think it's a valid request. Staff members are using time and effort to fill that request. We believe that it's the staff's responsibility to make sure the whole board gets that information.
I think that seems great, actually.
Agreed.
Yeah, it hasn't been practiced in the past, but I think it would make me feel significantly more informed if that were the case. So,
right. So what winds up happening? Oh, I'm sorry, please.
So would that also hold if the chair takes an issue to the superintendent? Would the superintendent sort of report out the answer to everyone so that we don't, that takes the burden off of Sarah to do that, or the chair to do that communication connection?
So typically when a report, let's say a member of the team, a member of the school board, the governance team says, I would like to have data on how third grade English language learners did last year, right? I was at a community meeting and the Latino Chamber of Commerce wants to know that. Dr. Estrella says, that's a great question. Let's pull the data and information. That data information should be shared with the entire board, that this question came in and here's the report that we generated based on a question that came from the Latino Chamber of Commerce. I'm just using that as an example.
Got it.
That same example could be used with any other group, whether it's, any other group that may make a request, or it may be something that's keeping an individual board member at night. Godfrey may have a question about something that came up while he was meeting with youth in the community. And he said, you know what, I'd really like to know if we have a disproportionate number of students being suspended that are ninth graders at this school versus that school. That information should be shared with them. The superintendent will attempt to notify the board chair. If chair is not available, the vice chair, followed by the secretary, will be contacted of an emergency or potential newsworthy event as soon as possible via phone, text, email.
Can you hear me on Zoom?
Now I'm going to walk you through a couple of strategies that allows this to occur very quickly and rapidly, but always remember, everything we put in writing, everything we say on a recorded device are all part of open records, which is fine. We have nothing to hide, but we just have to be careful that we don't use individuals' names. We think about HIPAA and FERPA and other issues that may arise. Okay, what I'm going to do is jump down to one of the strategies.
Excuse me, Robert, just to have board members and community at large, the document is in the governance folder now. So if you want a larger view of the document, please feel free to go to the folder.
Thank you. So this is the real difficult question. When and how should the superintendent communicate with the board? If you think about it, the complexity of having a school district with a bunch of schools, a lot of kids, something is going to happen almost every day that could be an issue for somebody, right? One kid goes home, He tells his parents he's being bullied. The parent is upset. They call the school. Dr. Estrella may not have known about it. The principal may not have known about it. The teacher may not have known about it, right? And then we get caught flat-footed because an issue occurs at the school. So this is very complicated. But some of the things that we can do to mitigate that risk is that Dr. Estrella will be sending a weekly board report, which will be used to inform, stimulate discussion, get feedback. This same report could be shared with staff, the public, and the media. And it's important that Dr. Estrella contact board members regularly through calls, emails, texts. And I'm going to show you what a voice memo is. This is a sample that I actually used as a school superintendent. Right before the end of the night, we negotiated a contract with the teachers union, and I had to find a very quick way to call 7 board members and let them know, because the news was about to start at 11 o'clock, and I didn't want them to hear about the successful negotiation on the news, but it was impossible for me to be able to call 7 people, and individually and get that news out. So I'm going to share an example of a very easy tool. Good evening, board members. It's Robert Abosa with a quick update. I wanted to let you know that we reached agreement tonight with the union on an overall 3.22% pay increase. Although it's a little bit above what we wanted to spend, I'm super thrilled to share with you that over 7,000 teachers will actually see a 3.5% increase. Those are the ones rated highly effective. And the teachers rated effective will see a 2.75% pay increase. I've directed staff not to provide the increases based on a flat sum, but actual salaries. That was a very popular move. We've also increased 10 percentage points over the next 2 years, the amount of money that coaches and extra stipends that are given at the school level. They haven't seen an increase in that in over 10 years. So overall, a very good night. If you include the bonuses that the state will give, the average teacher in our district will see a 5.4% increase this year. And again, I'm proud of the work we did. I think we reflected you and your priorities very well. If you have any questions at all, please let me know. We'll be bringing this to you all, and then hopefully the teachers will ratify it quickly, get the money out to them right after Christmas or winter break. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. I wanted to make sure you heard it from me. The media and the news travels so fast, we literally just finished tonight. All right, so do you see the importance of getting that information out to the school board? I knew it was going to be on social media, Twitter, and all this, and it's so important that we reflect the board's priorities in these kinds of things. And I want them to know that, you guys are in a tough place as a governance team. You want to give teachers good pay, you want to support them. Sometimes we can, and sometimes we can't. But this is a very easy way for Alex to send out a memo to you. And then in the end, you notice I said, if you have any particular questions, feel free to call me. Does that make sense? Okay. This is the kind of tool, again, that we believe will allow information to quickly get to you. Now imagine this. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, school superintendent, Fulton County. I get news from my police officer that there's been a shooting on campus, right? I need to worry about that issue. Contacting the school board and letting everybody know is important, but I also need to make sure that I'm doing what I can to lead the district through this crisis. So in an event like that, what I typically do is send out a memo like this, and then I have the regional superintendent who's responsible for that particular school. In that case, it was Dr. Fenoy. That area superintendent would call the impacted school board member and give her, in this case, it was South County, give her the details that he had at that time. Does that make sense? Because that individual board member would be the closest to the issue and most likely to get contacted quickly. And then they also were responsible for contacting the board chair. Does that make sense? Now, we could talk a little bit more about whether that makes sense to you or not. Again, God forbid there's that kind of event, but we know that there are issues that come up. Let's talk a little bit about some reaction to this slide that I've shared. Anybody have any reaction to it?
Robert, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just had a reaction, not to this slide, but regarding reports and communication. There was a piece that I missed, and I also had a question about it. So I don't know if you want to save that for later or just the slide, but I just wanted to.
No, you froze for just a second. Can you start from the beginning?
I had a question around the communication piece regarding reports that were requested by board members. And
Yes, this is a good time to say that.
so in terms of one, a time to revisit how the process is going to monitor requests and also looking at why we are requesting information. I think it would be helpful for us to come back to that, just to look at if there are standing items that are consistently requested that would make sense to have ready for us in a dashboard form. Similar to how NOWALK collaborates with us. I think it's a worthwhile idea to consider, being mindful of the amount of legwork that takes place in generating the reports that come to my mind.
I think that's a fantastic point, Godfrey. And what we do is, as Dr. Estrella becomes more knowledgeable of all the policies and procedures that you have in place, that is a fantastic suggestion and one that we definitely need to mark up as a priority. Excellent point.
Just to move away, some concrete examples.
Sorry. Say that again, sir.
Just some concrete examples, I want to share. Like when I reflect back on the meetings this year, consistent information that was typically presented to us was enrollment, attendance at different points of the year. The example you mentioned around suspensions, and also even the example around population. I know often those were things that were requested for meetings, all with the intent to either help clarify or help provide more evidence around to support our decision making. So I don't know if that's going to change, but those are examples of concrete things that I can recall getting on a more frequent basis.
Excellent. I think we can have a separate discussion as a governance team about what those might look like. And there may be some things that you've not thought about, but a board member has. All right. Thank you for that. So at this point, we need to move.
Robert, you're freezing a little bit.
On to this notion of having business in terms of contacting. Is it okay for board members to contact staff? We have a sort of best practice around staff
Robert, you froze for a little bit, so we missed the beginning of what you said.
Okay. On this slide, is it okay for board members to contact staff? We know that if contact is made, let's say there's a question that goes to one of the cabinet members, there's a best practice that staff member needs to share with the superintendent within an hour. That's always, a rule that I've had. And it's important because there's times when information comes in from a variety of different sources, and we need to be efficient and effective with the time that we do have. It's inappropriate to ask as a board member to tell the staff, hey, look, don't tell the superintendent, but I'd like for you to help me push this idea. That's just not fair to the staff member. And I've been in situations where individual school board member, had gone to one of the cabinet members and said, hey, look, see what you can do to help this individual out. And please don't tell Dr. Ravosa, right? Don't put that staff member in that kind of position. And I'm certainly not saying that you as individuals would, but it's a very difficult position for the staff member to be in, considering that, you've kind of gone around that and you're talking about them not telling their boss something. And then, of course, this idea that, Alex has got to agree that she's going to give the board weekly updates. And one of the reasons to do that, it's a big topic, maybe multiple topics. Did I freeze?
You froze for a
You
bit.
did for just 1 sec.
Okay. So let's get some reaction a little bit now from the board about
froze again.
About the,
Oh my
let's get some
goodness.
reaction from the board about contacting staff.
I'll start. I like this communications protocols. I mean, I think, is it okay to contact board members to contact staff? Yes, on certain occasions where you need information right away. I think the superintendent 60-minute rule is a great rule to have. And as far as the inappropriate to ask staff to not notify superintendent, I've never heard of that in my years on the board. And that definitely would be inappropriate. I don't think historically we have that issue on our board. And then sharing the discussions in a board update, Dr. Estrella has been doing that. So I think communication as a whole is important. And I think we continually work on that, but I think we've done a pretty good job so far on that.
For sure. I think it's really important to be clear about this boundary too. And even though I don't think we historically have had that problem necessarily for asking staff to not notify the superintendent of things, I think it's good that it's on this card because I think it's important to just reiterate for everybody that there's a boundary and also that everybody that we're talking to in the school system is at work and we're not. And that's a thing. So I don't know. I just think that's a succinct way of reminding everybody about that.
Excellent. Do you guys see Dr. Estrella? Oh yeah, there she is. Dr. Estrella, let's talk a little bit about your reaction to this and your thoughts.
So for me, I think we started this conversation with the executive committee in terms of the importance around communication and being very clear in terms of how that process is outlined. I've also had conversations with the cabinet about keeping me abreast of any communication that's coming from the board so that we're clear in terms of how to mitigate those concerns or conversations, right? To me, it's really important that we have clarity around how we are communicating so that there's no miscommunication. I think the community at large has set an expectation, and I've heard this frequently, that communication is something really important to them. So the more that we as a governance team model those practices, the more effective it will become as a system in setting up communication guidelines that will extend not only within the governance team, but the system at large. So I think that these protocols that are outlined, especially having my staff immediately communicate with me around what's going on or questions that might arise, will help us better streamline the work that we do. And I think you mentioned it before, and Dr. O'Gorman did as well, around the importance of collecting data around patterns of concern that keep coming up for the community so that we can then strategize around goal setting or realigning practices that might not be effectively working, that might be creating some of the concerns that are being raised by the community at large.
That's excellent. And the communication is not just with
Oh dear.
and among the governance team. The communication is not just among the governance team, it's also Dr. Estrella to the principals and then with the community as well. Earlier, I mentioned the 3-time rule. It's important that the school board hear about an issue that they may be voting on at least 3 times before it occurs. The big issues, not small sort of.
Oh no.
Robert, your internet seems to be behaving a little badly.
All right, can we take a 5-minute break? Let me go see.
For sure.
Hang on 1 second. Let's take a quick stretch break.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm shutting my video for the same reason. I get a much clearer audio signal if the video is off. So I'm putting my video on if I'm talking, but if I'm not talking, I'm just listening and it comes through more clearly if I have the video off.
Tom? Can any of you guys hear me? I just turned on the booster.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not in the room. I'm remote, but I can hear you.
That's fine, thank you. All right, thank you. I just turned on one of my boosters. I think maybe it was my problem, I don't know.
I couldn't hear you for a second there. Could you just explain the 60-minute rule to me?
Yeah, so the staff members find out about an issue that's been brought to them by a board member. That staff member needs to make sure to let Dr. Estrella know about that within an hour.
Okay, but this would be like either an issue that, like, I don't know, an incident that happened at a school, or it could be something, a longer term issue. It's not necessarily
like a bigger, like something to note, right? I mean, like if someone calls and said, my kid doesn't have a parking, spot at school, or something small that's easy to solve, then, these are things that, and again, it will take time for Dr. Estrella to really get a sense of what issues rise to that occasion, if that makes sense.
right. Okay. Okay, so it's just a matter of whatever, presenting stuff.
Yeah, they'll have to sort that out as a team.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Madam Chair, I switched over to a booster that I have,
Okay.
like that. I think it was me, I don't know, but I just switched over to a 5X thing that we moved over here. So I think
That's great. You sound much less stuttery now. It was
Okay.
going to dip, dip, dip before.
well, I think in my neighborhood, everybody's got like 18 devices chewing up
Sure.
every bit of internet.
Everybody's running the internet at once now, all the time.
Mhm.
Is everybody back? Doesn't seem like I can text Godfrey. So much time on these devices. Okay.
How are we doing?
Oh, there we go.
Doing good. I just reset my internet with a booster.
Okay.
Moved it right here. I think it was me, but I apologize for that. We'll give everybody another minute, Madam Chair, or are we good?
I think everybody is back.
Yeah, we're good. Let's go.
All right. So we're continuing on our conversation around communication protocols. As was mentioned, Dr. Estrella has been providing the board a packet. This includes backup materials, things that will be needed. Each board member will receive the Wednesday before the Tuesday board meeting. And after the packet has been delivered, but before the board meeting, the superintendent will hold a series of meetings or calls based on what you prefer. Some school board members would like to meet face-to-face. Others prefer a call. Some might want to do a Zoom. And it's really Alex's responsibility to provide opportunities that make sense for you.
May I ask a question about that? Just per FOIA, these would be one-on-one calls, or because we're not allowed to discuss things in groups of more than 3, I think privately. So
That's right.
So these are
Go ahead, Alex.
It's 4, Sarah.
Gotcha.
So these would be one-on-one conversations with individual board members. And the goal is to reach clarity around any questions, concerns about agenda items that are articulated, and also will provide an opportunity for us to have conversations around any pending questions that will need answers so that we are well prepared to respond to those concerns as they come up during our board conversations on Tuesdays.
Got it.
Board members agree to ask questions at these meetings so that there's clarification. And the reason it's important to ask questions is that there's a good chance there may be a question asked that the superintendent doesn't have an answer to, but needs to get before that meeting. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of board members, don't want to be seen in the community as not asking questions about a topic. And so it's okay if a board member had asked that question before in a private meeting with the superintendent to ask it again so that the community sees that you're asking that question and that answer is responded to publicly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Because what we want to be able to do is be prepared as a staff to respond to questions. The last thing we want to do is to have a really complex question posed at the board table and say, we're gonna need a day or two to figure, to get that answer to you or to run that analysis, etc. So it's important that there are no surprises and that goes both ways, that superintendent would not be bringing things to you that you've not heard before. And the same thing goes the opposite way, which is if you do have questions, those questions should be posed to staff so they can be prepared to respond to them. Questions or concerns raised by citizens at board meetings will be reviewed by staff and may be addressed by staff and reported to the board in a weekly report. So we've all been there, sitting at the dais. Someone comes up under public comment and says something, right? They make a big complaint about something, and we typically don't respond to those complaints at that time. We say, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Staff member goes, talks to the parent, gets their name and phone number and contact info, responds back to the parent. Now, board members will typically say, well, what happened? What was that resolution? And it's important that the staff, when those issues are raised at the board table, that the board gets some sort of understanding in the next board update about what happened with the issue that was raised. Any thoughts or reactions on that? Do you have parents that come or teachers that come to the board meetings and share thoughts and ideas that aren't always,
That aren't always.
that aren't, it's not like they're coming there to thank you for doing such a great job.
Oh.
They usually have a problem, a concern, right?
Sure.
And board members may want to know, well, whatever happened with that lady who came and talked about how terrible her experience was in the autism program or whatever.
For sure. No, this seems really great.
Okay. All right, we'll continue on. We're almost finishing our communication piece. The board, it's important that board members and staff depart meetings with the same expectations. And let me tell you how complicated this is. So, I'm a superintendent, I'm sitting at the dais. Each of the 7, 9, or 11 board members at that board table are giving their thoughts and ideas about an issue, right? And in the end, the superintendent is not really sure what the will of the entire board is. And so it would be Alex's responsibility to say, Madam Chair, I need more clarity. I've heard everybody's position on this, but I've not seen folks coalesce around a solution. And sometimes board members will leave a meeting and feel like they were crystal clear on what they wanted to have happen. And the following meeting, they would come and say, hey, I thought I was crystal clear. And, you may say as a superintendent, that was your position, but it certainly wasn't the position of the entire board. Does that make sense? again, each of you come to the table with a variety of different thoughts and ideas. But a decision needs to be made. It's very important that the superintendent, ask the chair for assistance in getting clarification around that.
Yeah.
Madam Chair, what's your reaction about that?
Well, my gut reaction is that sometimes the board does not have a unified intent about something. And in those cases, I don't know, I don't want to immediately focus on the cases that I think are difficult in terms of this, but I think that it's like sometimes I won't know the answer is what I mean, based on whether it's an issue on which we have consensus or not. But I think that that's a conversation that Alex and I can have in that case, and I'll say I don't know, and we'll do our best.
The question really should be posed again: what is the desire of the board as a whole? And it's okay sometimes if you have to punt. If you're on a big issue, it's okay to say, you know what, we need to think about this some more. We need to have some additional conversation. We're not going to be able to make that decision tonight. How do you guys feel about that?
Sarah, if I could jump in, it sounds like one of the standards of protocol that this protocol is sort of requiring is that we as the 9 board members really kind of speak very openly and explicitly about how we feel about different issues, not necessarily in a public setting, but perhaps as a private caucus, so that we can, and in particular Sarah can, have some clarity about how we feel on different issues, even if we don't feel all the same about it. At least Sarah will know that.
For sure. It seems like this sort of requires that we really know each other's thoughts so that I am able to communicate them.
And there are going to be times where the board will have a split decision, and we have to be okay with that and understand that it's not personal, and that it's just a position that you've taken. Maybe it's the position of the constituents that you represent, or it could be a personal position.
I just think, can I just add something, Robert? I think the important piece when there is opposing viewpoints around a particular matter is just reaching clarity in terms of what are those opposing viewpoints, and like making sure that there's clarity in terms of the expectation of the board to the superintendent as a result of that, of the alternative perspectives, right? So it could be that we're looking, you're asking to look at a particular issue in 2 different dimensions, and you want to utilize that to reach clarity around a point. But I think as we continue to develop our communication, it's going to be important that even when there's disagreement, that we work in reaching clarity in terms of what are the opposing viewpoints and how do the board at large want me as a superintendent to proceed, if that makes sense. And
that's
Madam Chair.
Yeah, I personally think that's the right way, but I'd like to hear from the school board a little bit about that.
For sure. Does anybody else have any thoughts about that? Alex, I think that was a good sort of crystallization of the.
I mean, in my experience, working with youth, it's never been 100% of times the adults have agreed on what is best for youth. So coming from that position, I expect to hear different perspectives about an issue. But as it relates to something that's like more concrete, we can have our opinions, but I gather any discussion around voicing our opinions is all prior to making a decision or a vote, and I think it comes down to each issue, and keeping in mind that we are representing our districts, so whether we are talking about internally in a caucus, there is that expectation to make sure to validate our district's perspective around certain issues that has to be voiced, and I think not getting lost that us voicing and doing what's expected of us as elected officials doesn't get confused with holding up a decision being made. I think the more we live in context of concrete examples around the situation, I think we'll be able to move forward to just a cleaner process that can be adopted for specific situations. Because it's hard to have a global discussion without putting in the context of each of the things that I'm reflecting about as we're talking about it, just leading up to everything we voted on this year.
You nailed it. You nailed it, Godfrey. One of the places that should occur is what we would call work sessions. So let's say we bump into a really meaty issue that we need to address. Maybe it's a redistricting, maybe it's opening a new school or closing a school. Those work sessions would also be another public meeting, correct? Because assuming that's correct.
About it's all of us. Okay.
Yes. So you could do, the work session is typically the entire board. Again, a strategy that you all could do is smaller group meetings that still are within the open records. I'm sorry, the FOIA and other sort of implications. You just can't. I think it's 4 is what I heard earlier, but you can do small group meetings, but I prefer work sessions where you can go deeper as a group. But what are your thoughts?
I think some of that would require us solidifying, the expectations of reports that we're requesting from Alex, from staff, because going into a work session the same manner we go into a workshop or a board meeting, we would be gathering evidence, I'm hoping, for the purpose of making a decision. Just data, getting the information, I found it just isn't a helpful practice and isn't really mindful of time given to produce those things. And I know Colin's point earlier, just around leveraging caucus, is just the opportunity for the board to be authentic in their conversation as we move forward as a group.
I have a question. I know that our meetings are divided into business meetings and workshops. And I'm wondering if the intent of the workshops initially was to be sort of like this, and over time, when Dr. Adamowski was the superintendent, if it evolved into sort of more of a presentational use of the time rather than a, like this, a sort of a deep dive in a discussion sort of situation. So I am wondering if we already have a structure in place that we can revise to include this goal. Does that make sense?
I think so. I also believe that it's not every work session that'll be like that, right? There are typical reports that should come to the board. Your job is oversight. Periodically you need to see what HR is doing and get a report about it. Periodically you need to look at finance and budget. Each department should be providing, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well, which is what does that cadence look like over the course of the year? What does the board want to see? And I can share with you what typical best practice is about, getting an annual report on special education, English language learners. That's usually the typical practice. But periodically getting into deep dives like this, I think helps the team get stronger. And when you hear what's important to Heidi and why it's important to her, we move closer together as a team. We may not always agree on it, but at least we begin to see that, and then we respect one another's opinion, and that helps us as a government.
Robert, what if, and I like the idea of the work sessions and what Sarah was bringing up as well, but, with the presentations, they mostly are presentations. So if we had a work session maybe in between, might be a great idea. and maybe start off every other or every few. I think kind of delving in and working cohesively as a board and with staff during some of these work sessions, I think might be very productive.
Okay. Superintendent, we're recording this. We're going to be going back and taking notes of the recording. And I think that's a great idea as well.
I'm taking notes.
Okay. I want to go back to what we were talking about around the 15-minute rule. I had talked earlier, Godfrey had mentioned, well, what kind of reports might need to come to the board just as standard, maybe monthly reports, etc. One of the rules that we believe is very, very important is sort of this 15-minute rule. So if a request comes in that's very quick, it could be something that can be answered on the telephone. Want to get the board's reaction on how these requests should be managed. If it takes more than 15 minutes, then it needs to be, we recommend that those things go back to the board and have a discussion. Should we be spending our time and energy filling this request or this request? What are your thoughts about that? So a school board member calls in and says, I need to know this, right? And staff says, look, superintendent, this is going to take us about an hour to put together. Should that request go back to the board to be approved and then be disseminated or not?
I think for sure, at least a step where the request goes, if it's a longer request than 15 minutes, if it goes back to maybe the executive committee, even if it can't go to the full board, I think for the full board, that would be fine. It would just require whomever was requesting sort of make the case for why they think the information is important. But I think, as I was saying earlier, it's important for us to remember that boundary that everybody that we're talking to is at work and they have work to do. It's their job to do. So
I have a comment on that. I know that with the committees and everything that was happening this year with COVID, the budget, school opening, I know there was a lot of requests through committees, and those requests were not 15-minute rule, but those were also not requests that we would do on a regular basis. So I think we would need to specify the difference between what we need to do, what requests are allowed through the committee, even though they're more than 15 minutes, but we don't need them like right then and there or the next day. We would need it for the following meeting. I mean, I think there's a difference between I need to know something today to answer something tomorrow to I need information for next meeting. And I know there was a lot of requests on all committees. There was just so much going on that I think we need to clarify the differences in information requested.
For sure. That's a great point, Diana. And I'm wondering, because each of our committees has a central office staff member that is part of the committee, if it makes sense for like those discussions in between the committee chair and the central office staff member to sort of be categorically different than requests for information by board members as individuals. Does that make sense?
I think it does, because to me, it sounds like it's bringing in the intent in the conversation around like determining how make a decision about how requests is handled. Because I believe, I agree with Diana's perspective, just in the example of things that were requested during COVID around committees. I'm taking that to be there was a very clear reason for the request of the data. Not saying anyone here is requesting information because it's interesting to see, but the connection to it being relatable to the committee kind of outlines or opened up discussion around what information do we essentially need to operate in our role as a committee chair, or just be able to move forward on a committee issue. But I think intent is where the discussion might make more sense living in for why you're asking for data reports.
But I also want the team to be mindful of some of the challenges that could potentially also present in terms of the overload of information requests that some of the cabinet members have to manage and receive. I think that although there's specific items that are associated with committees, we need to figure out how to streamline the requests and also like kind of almost progress monitor the input of requests being made to cabinet members, because I know depending on the committee, I've heard mixed reviews in terms of the abundance of information being requested, the amount of time that that takes from them being able to do their work effectively. So I think we need to put this back at in the forefront of the conversation and kind of reconsider. I know that within committees, there are particular conversations that need to happen with members of the cabinet, but also sometimes because of the amount of information being requested, it takes away from that cabinet member's duties and responsibilities in the day-to-day operations of their work. So I think we really need to consider maybe having someone at the central team who collects the questions and information requests, and then I can work with that individual to disseminate to the different committee leads, and also be able to then collect data to speak with the board at large and say, hey, you know, I noticed these trends. I just want you to understand how much time this is taking and what that could potentially take time from. I don't know how you feel about that, but I think we need to consider how we are engaging in these conversations and the requests, because it could be very time consuming. Not that it's not necessary, but it might interfere with other important work. And I know COVID is unique because that presented unique circumstances, but as we continue to normalize the new normal, it's something we need to be cognizant of.
I think those are really valid, good points, Alex. And I don't know if we're going to be able to make a decision here today on that. So I think that's something that you want to also discuss with your staff, the best way that can be done and how it can be disseminated out. I think there just needs to be more dialogue and more conversation because it's a big concern. So we want to make sure that we get it right.
Sure. The other thing I'll say is that I know I've heard from a number of board members that they feel like we could use technology to make the information more accessible to us without staff having to work to provide it for us. And I think that's just something we should keep in the back of our minds as we move forward.
That's an excellent point. There are some tools that create dashboards for most requested information. So let's put a pin in that. Let's go back to that at some point in the near future. And maybe there are some ways to automate that.
I mean,
okay, sorry.
You know, for time's sake, you know, to me, the idea I mentioned earlier in reviewing what is being requested to keep the conversation more specific and just see trends, you know, being clear, like the why and when things were requested, I think would really help us, the board, you know, after Alex, you connect with you, to be clear.
Is this information that we need?
You know, just be managing, not getting overwhelmed with information.
Godfrey.
Godfrey, you're breaking up. Something's happening with your
Well, before repeating what I said, I strongly
support the idea of looking at dashboards to help gather information that's relevant to the board. I think it's a good starting point.
And Paula will be joining us as, I'm getting feedback. Paula will be joining us at some point, and we can definitely have her work with NORC Acts in potentially creating a dashboard that will help us engage in this process.
For sure.
All right.
Diana, it looks like you're not on mute.
thank you for your discussion on that. I do want to move over to constituent services, and this is really where most of you get individual complaints or concerns. I did read through all of your policies about, what you ask your parents to do, but you know what happens when you have a problem at a store. You don't want to talk to whoever answers the phone. You call and say, I want to talk to the manager. Who's the manager, right? And so parents, instead of contacting the teacher or the principal or the superintendent's office, they may go straight to the school board member. And it's so important that Alex and the cabinet understand the position of the board when these issues come in, which is, look, I'm supposed to be responsive. I just can't give a canned answer and say, thank you for your complaint. I'll turn it over to somebody. Board members feel like they'd like to have an opportunity to show their constituents that they care and that they're responding. And that's perfectly normal. Staff needs to understand that. How board members handle complaints or information requests regarding this is important, and we need to talk a little bit about best practices in this area. Board members have an obligation to be accessible, as I said, to take those questions, suggestions, and complaints. And over the years, the best practices that have come out of the Center for Reform of School Systems, CRSS, Dr. Gorman mentioned that yesterday. I'm going to share with you what that looks like, and then I'd like to have the board's reaction to that. So lots of complaints and issues come in. Board members feel like they need to be responsive, which is normal. Staff needs to make sure that they're resolving issues and that we think about all the rules, regulations, and policies you've put in place around sort of the chain of command. And we know that people aren't always going to use that. So it's very important that when those issues come in, and I'm going to recommend that the board members respond to the constituents, say, thank you very much for, sharing your thought and idea of, whatever the concern is with me. I've copied the superintendent's office on this. And, you guys can work on maybe, I don't want to say a canned response, but 2 or 3 sentences that you can use as the body of your response with a little bit of nuance on the top and the bottom to help everybody understand, the process. And that would go to Alex's office, right? Maybe the executive assistant, who then will keep track in a spreadsheet of all the concerns that come in, whether they've been solved, whether they're yellow and that they're still in action, or whether it's been solved, but the constituent was not happy. Because there are times when you're going to have to say, I'm sorry, the answer is no. And then we have to mark that as red. The response did occur, but the constituent was not happy. The question is, what was their disposition? And we need to be able to say they were happy, they were okay with it, they could live with it, or they were not okay with it, but the answer was still no. That way, periodically, the staff goes back, looks at all the complaints quarterly and says, all right, we've got a major problem with the way athletics is rolling, or we have a major problem with this because these trends emerge. And then we may say, wow, we've got an assistant principal at this school who is suspending kids at a very high rate. Let's figure out what's going on over here. Why are parents so upset at this school? Some reaction.
So if nobody else has one to jump in, I think this is fantastic because my experience on the board, I have often in the history of my career had to have a really strong customer service mindset. And I think having a way to track the emotional response of constituent complaints is really great. I think that's a really fantastic thing. The one thing I'll say is that when I was first on the board, actually not just right when I was absolutely first on the board, but in the beginning of my time on the board, I did try to draft for the chair at the time a response that was not like essentially like just a ready to go response, like, oh yes, we've got your email, heard you, and we're going to refer it, so forth. And unfortunately, constituents pushed back on using the same language in the response, and they posted on social media that they got the same email back in response to different complaints that they had sent, and that they thought that that was untoward. So I don't know if that's just something that we just live with, people's dissatisfaction at receiving a canned response, and that it's better that they have a response. But I just wanted to mention that that was an experience that we'd had.
I would also add that this is an incredibly cool and powerful thing for us, and will make our experience as board members more productive and I think less unpleasant in terms of that tension between constituent needs and not overburdening the staff. And I love using it as an indicator of trends. I remember that I attended, before I was elected, I attended the retreat in 2017. And I remember Shirley Mosby essentially asking for something just like this. And so it's great that for 3-4 years later, we're actually able to make it happen. So thank you so much. What a great move forward.
I'll also just add a comment to that as well. I think, it's important to address situations when they happen. And I understand, Sarah, your point, you don't necessarily want a canned response for every constituent concern. So I'm wondering if there's a way we can craft something that's not necessarily unique to every situation, but something that really reaches our constituents and their concerns, and then stating that we will be forwarding this over to the superintendent's office, but some kind of follow-up where the superintendent's office will have follow-up. And then we'll also know what happened. So there's some kind of closure on it. But I think we do get lots of emails and concerns, and it's addressed to 9 board members. And I think I brought this up yesterday. So if all 9 board members have a response, you really want it centralized. You really want one person that's looking at these emails, responding, and then sending it over to the superintendent's office, and then letting us know as a board what the outcome was to that situation. So whether it was a spreadsheet or some kind of accountability, but as a board, we want to be able to know that who's ever put in that concern, that there has been closure.
That's great. I also think it's important to acknowledge that just like not living in assuming that what's presented to us only comes up in the form of email. I'm thinking more of the communities that we belong to. For example, I was on school governance council of my children's elementary school. And I think the majority of the current board members have been on school governance councils, and being part of a community and at community events and being approached is another layer of things that I think as this current board has to also deal with, because pivoting away from how you were received and known in your community is also the challenging piece around it. And I want to acknowledge that it's hard to hear a problem that you agree is a problem and share a blanket response. I only bring this up because I think it's also important to include a way to talk about considering, do we want to streamline information brought to us in person? Because, again, it's just it's another way how it happens.
Yes.
Sorry.
Can I speak up? I have to agree with Godfrey. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Because being on PTOs, SGCs, going to all the school events, and like Godfrey says, the people that you know in your district, someone will always come up to you and ask you a question, bring up a comment, a concern, and we do have a blanket answer. However, if we could all be on the same page, and if we can get an information on how to handle those, I think it would be good, because sometimes it depends on the topic and the person. It gets misconstrued by what the Board of Ed person said, and then it just becomes wildfire on social media.
Look, there's no easy answer to these kinds of issues. I work with school districts from Texas to Washington to East Baton Rouge. And these are unfortunately, it's part of the prevailing condition of being a board member. Pete Corman always says people in Michigan don't complain about the cold, but the reality is when you deal with people, you know, it's hard because I think Godfrey said it best. Sometimes an issue is brought to you and it's kind of embarrassing because you agree with the person and we let him down somehow, you know? We just can't let it hit us personally. And we got to be able to be good listeners. We've got to be able to respond, but we also have to manage our expectations and our roles as board members and on the governance team. But there's some issues that are administrative and management, and then there are some issues that are policy driven. So, you know, there's no easy answer here, but the more we talk about it and the more we get clarity on what we'd like to see the staff do, we're able to mitigate the number of issues that get to you. Does that make sense?
I think it all makes sense. I just want to add just one final thought. I think, and I mentioned this yesterday, just being responsive right away, because, you know, we all get lots of emails and they can kind of get lost in a thread and you don't want that to happen. So as soon as there's an email, we figure out how we're going to word that as far as a response, an appropriate response. And if it needs to go to central office, which it will, the superintendent's office, they can mention that they are working on it. It could take 24 hours, it could take 48, but I think for most people, even in your everyday life, you want to be heard and you want a response back, whether it's within a day, 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever it may be. But I think it's just, you might not have the answer at that moment, but just to let that person know that you are working on the issue. I think just being responsive, and I'm actually glad we're spending a little bit more time on this because this has been an issue that we've had for a while. So hopefully we can work out some type of consensus on this and how we can move forward and handle it.
So I was
Can I
just, sorry.
Go ahead.
Just one perspective from like my own personal perspective. I think it's really, really tough to sort of meet every single expectation. And I hear Sarah's point that some people like getting a quick answer, and some people say, well, gosh, that's a canned answer. It's not good enough. One of the things that I think has been helpful for me is managing the expectations. And I'll elaborate on that. So one is, we live in an age that everybody's hyper digital connected, right? Those of us who teach know that our students are just, live on their phones and so on. And sometimes people contact you and their expectation is that you need to respond immediately, particularly as a public servant. And that's not the case with me. I guarantee that I will respond to everything within 24 hours and to emergencies before that. But I don't think it's fair to have people expect me to be at their beck and call. That's just my personal perspective. But the other thing is, one of the things that I think has been super helpful in terms of the constituent care that we were talking about earlier is helping our constituents better understand the process. And as Heidi says, as we talk it through and it becomes clear even to us, we can share that clarity with our constituents. I have found that even when people don't like the exact answer you give them, the fact that they know how the answer was derived makes them feel a little less frustrated, right? And so, letting them know, like, hey, this is how the public school system works. This is the process. This is the protocol. I think may help some, not all, constituents feel not so left out of the communication.
Colin, I'm so glad you said that because I think people don't have clarity around how the school system works, what our function is, who's actually in charge of what piece of what they're upset about. And I think that I love that you have such an emotionally healthy way of describing how the expectations should be. And I'm wondering if we are able to, which of course we are able to, but I'm wondering if it makes sense to have a canned response that has sort of a slightly educational expectation setting component to it, like, hi, we got your email. And if you haven't already, here is, like, if it's a classroom issue, the teacher, if that didn't work, the principal, just a quick, or even a link to the procedure that we have for escalating issues up the chain of command kind of thing.
That is a very good idea. I like that. And remember, earlier I had mentioned if we could just have sort of the middle of the response canned, right? And just like you said, Madam Chair, where it does explain, hey, look, if you haven't already, make sure you contact your teacher or the school principal, et cetera. So Dr. Estrella, I think that sounds like something maybe staff could put together and maybe send to the board and they can begin using. Any closing thoughts on this, Alex?
So I think that Colin, Madam Chair, I think you bring very good perspectives on that and something we could definitely do. One of the things that I'm thinking is the possibility of setting someone in the central team as kind of like the communication facilitator, where when these concerns come up, we can log them, keep track of patterns of concerns, but then also that person can be the mediator in ensuring that the parents' concerns are addressed and that we can then circle back on a weekly Friday report, providing the board an update in terms of the communication and where the concern is in respects to having the matter addressed. So I don't know, Madam Chair, how you feel about that.
I think that sounds like a great idea. And I think I was just thinking as you were speaking that it's so difficult to, because there are so many expectations on all our staff and teachers and central office people, it's difficult to inhabit a customer service mindset when you have so many other things that you have to be doing besides focusing on that. And I think having somebody that's dedicated to that piece of customer service isn't exactly the right phrase, but we don't have another one. Constituent responsiveness or, you know, that kind of thing. Having someone that's in their job function, I think will make it much easier for everybody else too.
And I think setting the expectation, like you articulated before, in terms of like our process of communication, but also letting them know that they will receive a response, and we can talk more about setting a time frame so that people have realistic expectations around the amount of time it might take to circle back to them with follow-up. It's going to be also helpful.
Agreed. Mike, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing I think that's part of all this, and because it's a range of requests or what people contact, but there's this misunderstanding, like there's this label of like the Board of Ed, and they kind of confuse the 9 of us with central office versus the superintendent. You know, we're all kind of lumped together. A lot of these people think we're paid and this is like a job for us, so we should just drop everything and respond to them. I mean, someone has said this earlier, there is a lot of misunderstanding. So, you know, maybe, you know, because people are busy and it's obviously a huge burden for the superintendent, both the superintendent and for the board chair. You know, I know we talked about having a special person on the board who would respond to this, but I think, you know, I don't think we have anything on our website. I know our website has got too much stuff, but there's got to be a place where either, you know, the chair or whoever the board member responsible for this can cut and paste. And we worked on something on some of this a while ago, but, you know, to be able to, so you could respond right away saying, look, this is the chain of command. This is who's who, you know, these people are volunteers. These are the paid professionals. I don't know how you know, each obviously time we get one of these contacts, they're not always the same, but, you know, I think responding quickly and explaining things is half the battle. And so if we could come up with some kind of system that way, I think it would take a lot of pressure off everybody, as well as being more responsive to our, you know, constituent body or our stakeholders.
Can I add to what he said? I agree that what we need to do is educate the public on the nuances between central office and the Board of Education and our various roles. And we worked hard on the document a couple years ago, but it's sort of buried on the website. You know, as I reflect on how successful the video communication that the team put out regarding the reopening, perhaps we can do something similar for the board to try and push out this communication rather than expecting people to sort of find it on the website, but instead do almost an education campaign to the community about our roles and the best way to and our policies regarding community feedback or complaint. It might be helpful to break it down and push it out to where people are.
We could do a little podcast, just like we just did.
Yes.
You read my
indeed.
mind, Sarah.
Yeah, I have the microphone already.
We're ready. I think Sarah and I were in sync in terms of thought. In creating a podcast, reminding people of the communication process, and just also articulating who would be the designee for those concerns to be. They can go directly to you, and if works then you can. If we keep a system of rerouting until people get accustomed to knowing that any concerns. This is the inbox. We could even potentially set up an email specifically for people to post those concerns that the board can have access to. But then we can have one person in central office kind of distributing and following up to make sure that the concerns are addressed.
It's a great idea to have an email for it.
And I think, you know, what I loved about the communication that went out this week to the public was that it allowed the public to understand who the people in central office are. And I think when they can put a name and a face to an area of focus, that really helps them know who to talk to and understand the structures of things. So, you know, maybe it's also pushing out on social media vignettes of responsible staff so that people really understand who they are and what their purpose is and know that they're the person for an area of concern.
This is very good and rich conversation. This will help Dr. Estrella as she transitions in to create systems for the board of constituent services. And this slide here really identifies the staff's responsibility to the board to make sure that we're responding appropriately to members. Again, we've already gone through this. You guys are all gifted. I didn't even have to bring any of these up. But you know, we are, I think what we're hearing is that we need to have a management system for storing, tracking, categorizing, and analyzing. We do need to come up with a system that allows that these requests within a 72-hour period or 3 business days will have some level of resolution. I'm not saying it's going to take 72 hours to respond. The response from staff should be pretty quick in terms of, hey, I've gotten your request and we are going to look into this matter. We'll have a response back to you within the 72-hour period. This is just an easy way for us to show that constituent services is critical. These are all the things that we've mentioned before: periodic reports on systems of improvement, feedback, oversight of the system. I do really want to go back and reemphasize something that Mr. Godfrey had mentioned earlier about you know, those questions and concerns that come up at the grocery store, at the baseball game, at the PTA. So we do need to still sort of have that hanging out there as how we may want to do that. And some of our constituents may not want to, when you say, hey, email that to me, and they may not want to do that. They feel like just telling you that would be enough. Board members, board public response when there are disagreements over issues. Here's one of the last sort of big pieces around communication that we need to talk about. How do you all manage right now the press? Who speaks on behalf of the board? Do you have clear understanding of who that is? Can individuals speak? Is it the board chair?
So I think the understanding that I was, I don't want to use passive voice, the understanding that I developed when I stepped into the role as chair, and that I inherited from the previous chairs, was that it was the responsibility of the chair to talk to the press. However, when board members have been very good about this, when they're like, oh, this reporter called me or emailed me and wanted to know about my particular area of responsibility on the board, I'm thinking in particular of committee chairs, I've been like, yeah, sure, go ahead. I just, why shouldn't you talk to them? Which is I think the question that you're going to answer, like, why shouldn't you talk to them? Maybe it's something for us to think about. I don't know. This is a learning curve area for me.
And any other thoughts? As superintendent, we've always, my experience has been that the only one that can speak on behalf of the board is the board chair, but the board chair has to be very careful about speaking on behalf of the board on things that haven't been voted on yet. Now, if the board chair, a vote's been cast, even if it's a split vote, the reality is sometimes you're going to be on what people call, quote unquote, the winning side and the losing side, right? I hate that people use that terminology, but they do. Why was something voted up or voted down? So the Madam Chair, whose responsibility is to speak on matters that have been voted on, she can also, and again, unless you all disagree, speak on matters that are about to be voted on and say, this is going to be a contentious issue. There's going to be lots of debate and discussion, and I'm not sure where the board is going to land on it. Thoughts?
I think the board chair speaks to it all and then decides anyone different that would need to, because the elephant in the room, they're the board chair. Why wouldn't they be representing the board in whatever they say? And I think to me, it's pretty straightforward. It's the board chair or designee for that situation that's approved by her to speak to it.
For sure. I will also say that when I do talk to the press, if I'm expressing something that is my opinion, I'm careful to be very clear that I'm not speaking on behalf of the board if I'm not. So, but I think it's good to have that for future chairs, maybe clarified as a piece of expectation in writing or something.
I think that just as we discussed yesterday, that we have a lot of really well-educated, well-trained professional staff who I think should be the first line of communication so that there's no opportunity for misunderstanding or lack of clarity to the public. So I think that's our first line of defense. And then as far as the whole why should we not do something question, I think it would be great if we as a board and every board after us could agree to avoid politicizing school matters, so that when someone does speak to the press, it's not to gain a point in some way politically, but just to make sure that the community has information. Because I think that's really the most important function of working with the press, is that we are being transparent about the business that we are going about. And hopefully if we do our jobs well and everybody in central office does their jobs well, we can be entirely transparent and forthright about our actions because they're all in integrity. So that would, I think deferring to the professional staff first, and then perhaps having an agreement amongst ourselves to how we want our words to be taken in the press, such that education in our city does not become politicized, is very important.
One of the things that I wanted to point out in terms of the press, Madam Chair, I don't know how you feel about this, but I think because we have communications team, it would help if any press matters are discussed with that team so that there's symmetry of information, making sure that what the district office is communicating is well aligned with what the board is communicating and vice versa. Because I don't I think I want to make sure that we all avoid having a situation where we are engaging in conversation that is contradictory to one another, and having one place where press matters are funneled through, I think would be helpful. So even with the cabinet, and this is something I'm going to be communicating to all principals and other staff, any communication requests need to be directed to the communications team, Brenda Williams, so that there is clear structure around how we're messaging information. And I don't know if the board feels comfortable in also having that as the mainstream where press communication happens, so that we make sure that our messages are well succinct and aligned.
For sure. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking of, so in terms of protocols, in terms of like practice and procedure, oftentimes what will happen is like there'll be something that's on the horizon and Brenda and I will have communicated about it, or, you know, whatever. And then, you know, Nancy or Aaron will send a text or an email and be like, oh, do you have a comment? You know? And so do we feel like we want to make a distinction of practice in between comment, which is usually very brief and like, oh yes, I think this is a positive thing that we're about to do kind of thing, and a more lengthy sort of request for information from the press or a discussion of an issue? Or would everything, even comments, shall we have a discussion with Brenda first?
I think even for comments, because the comment might not align to another comment that was made, and we want to make sure there's alignment. Like my experience in the past has been that all press matters goes to the press office there, communications team here, so that there is alignment in simple comments, because simple comments can become headline news in some cases. So that would prevent us being in a situation where we are sending out mixed messages. Even if it wasn't intentional, it could happen.
For sure. I know. I think that's great. So moving forward, that'll be our protocol, that if we're going to comment to the press, we'll have a check-in with Brenda. And also, I think in terms of messaging, the fewer people that communicate leads to more clarity of message, which is great. And I also think that it will help. I don't want to impugn anybody's motives, and I don't intend to do so, but I think a lot of times there's a sort of this thing that happens, you know, and it leads to miscommunications at best. So,
You know,
All
I
right,
will
guys,
add that, if I just can add a final comment, I will add that Brenda has done a stellar job when she does communicate to the press. So I think funneling information over to Brenda, I think would be a wise idea for us.
So we're starting this.
excellent. Any other closing thoughts before we take a break? And I do have a little homework assignment for you while I think we'll take a little break. Any other closing thoughts?
I also agree that Brenda does an awesome job.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Madam Chair. I have 9:42 on my clock. If everybody's okay, we'll take about an 8-minute break. We'll be back at 10 till. And while you're taking a break, just be thinking about board priorities. That's our next piece. We're just going to brainstorm and hear from each one of the board members. We want to hear directly from each board member some of the things that he or she believe is a top priority, so that the superintendent, if she's not already heard it, can hear it again with her staff. Okay? Let's take about a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 9:50.
Sounds great.
Barbara, if you can hear me, can you tell me, give me a thumbs up if you see the slide?
Thumbs up.
Awesome, thank you.
Okie doke.
Guys, if you can hear me, go ahead and let's get back to our position. If you're there, turn on your camera. I'm keeping mine off just in case I have internet issues. It seems to work a little better with it off.
For sure. I have mine off for the same reason, but I'm back.
Dr. Estrella, if you are there, can you turn on your camera? I want to make sure you're here before we get started. For the board members who can hear me, like I mentioned before, we're going to be doing a bit of a brainstorming about high priority or things that are a concern. You're in a very unique opportunity. You just had a superintendent who's been there for about 5 years. You've got an opportunity to celebrate some of what had occurred in the past. There's some things that you want to see continue, but there's also maybe some things we want to do differently or some priorities that need to change. So we're going to go through and as a group brainstorm those ideas. I'd rather us talk about sort of the big hot button issues rather than creating a laundry list of to-dos for the superintendent. Those to-do lists will be created as a strategic plan, set of goals and priorities begin to emerge. So as soon as I see Alex back on, we'll go ahead and get started. Is that okay?
And you guys, sure, that's totally fine. Barbara is the only board member I can see. Barbara, is everybody else back in the room, or are you there actually in person or no?
I'm here. Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear? I don't see Heidi or Godfrey. I think Mike is there.
Okay.
I don't see Diana. I do see Colin.
Okay. So we're still waiting on a couple of
I
people.
see Mayor Rilling as well.
You know, this is a good exercise for us to think about kids sitting at home in a remote environment and us being really thoughtful about getting time to get up, you know, move your body a little bit, you know.
Yep. I'm teaching ESY right now, and I make sure that I build movement breaks in at least every like half an hour, if not more frequently, so that kids are not sitting.
I should have talked with you about some good ways to weave it into my presentation.
Oh, for sure. We can all do a go noodle. Yeah, Barbara, if you would just give us a heads up when you see everybody else come back, that would be helpful to me.
Sure.
I think Barbara's doing the morning session from home, though.
I am.
Yeah.
Oh.
Alex could, if you're meeting for the people in the room, then Alex is probably your best bet.
Oh, I didn't realize who's at home and who's not at home.
Yeah, it didn't seem necessary to take the risk to be.
No, for sure. 100%. I'm with you. Okay. So all of us that I can see are at home.
Mhm.
I got it. Okay. Well, maybe I'll text Godfrey then.
Yvette, you're there, right?
Yeah, this is Brenda. Godfrey's standing in the doorway. They haven't quite walked back in yet.
Okay.
Would you
Thank
like
you.
me to go get them?
I mean,
Good.
you could give a big wave or something.
I gave them a big wave and told them you were looking for them, and they're coming in.
Excellent. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you so much.
They noticed they were a little late, and they're coming in right this moment.
Hi, guys.
Hi. Thanks.
I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'll just repeat what I mentioned a little earlier. So if you heard it, I apologize. We'd like to spend the next 20 to 30 minutes, maybe a little longer, depending on folks' position. I think some of the priorities, may already be sort of shared among the group. You're in a very unique position in Norwalk in that you just finished a 5-year run with the school superintendent. You have an opportunity now to really think about, what went well the last 5 years or so. And this is not about the former superintendent or the former board. This is really just about the work. What's been going well? What would you like to see? And what are some big ideas and concerns that Alex and the team, as they come in and begin thinking about what the next strategic plan looks like? And of course, Dr. Gorman mentioned to you all, your responsibility is setting the goals. Staff's responsibility is the how, which is how are we going to get there? And that's really the operational side of the strategic plan. I don't want to have just a laundry list of things that need to be done. I'd really like to hear more of the big ideas and hot button issues, whether they're dealing with English second language learner gaps that exist or things like that. So Madam Chair, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can help sort of air traffic control, make sure each board member has an opportunity to be heard.
For sure. So I am going to just go from right to left on my screen here, and that puts Heidi in the hot seat first. Heidi, what would you say would be a high priority or a concern that Alex should be aware of?
Apologize for the muting and unmuting. I think continuing on the communications, and as I mentioned yesterday, I think we've come so far with communications, especially with Brenda at the helm and really working on that, but continuing that. And we just had dialogue about that and how we're going to streamline, constituents' concerns and making sure we get back in a timely fashion. So I think we want to continue that and just continue to be visible to the community as well, because I think that makes a huge difference as well. So those are some of the priorities. I have more that I'd like to discuss as we get further along, but I think continuing with communications, and the big thing right now, obviously, is COVID. We're in a pandemic, something we've never, ever seen in our lifetime. So there's been a lot of concern and uneasiness within the community on going back to school, hybrid model, remote learning. So I think keeping everyone abreast of that, and that's just not, it's parents and students as well, but also staff members, because I know staff are very, very concerned about that. So keeping that dialogue ongoing as we continue to move on and figuring out what we're going to do for the fall for our students and families.
Heidi, can I push you just a little bit on that visibility? Is the visibility also, like, so does Alex play a role in that as an individual, meaning as the school superintendent?
Yeah.
Should her visibility in the, see, I always refer to it sort of inward facing and outward facing, right? So to your point about staff hearing from the superintendent, and that I would consider that inward facing, and then outward facing would be sort of the chambers of commerce, the realtor groups, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, and also, yes,
more.
exactly. And in addition to that, I mean, I know with COVID, obviously this is difficult now, but, you know, going into schools, all of our schools, you know, going into our high schools, our middle schools and elementaries when we can, as a superintendent, I think that's very important to meet all staff, and not only staff, but students and parents as well. So our stakeholders for sure, absolutely, but just kind of getting embedded within the community. I know Alex has already started that from day one, even before that, but continuing, even though it's the beginning process for Alex as superintendent, that should be an ongoing, not necessarily a concern, but something that she will be doing on an ongoing basis.
All right, so that's something you want to see continue. All right, awesome.
Absolutely,
Thank you.
not just from the beginning, but throughout the school year and beyond. I think the visibility part, you know, she's talking to my colleague Diana just about how I'm a visual learner. I'm an auditory learner, but more visual. So when you were speaking earlier and we couldn't see everything, I thought, I have to hear you, but I also have to see. Like board priorities, you can discuss that and I can hear it, but I also have to look at it for it to resonate with me.
Yeah.
So I think as a superintendent, it's important to get out and meet the community. I really do believe that.
Thank you. Madam
Sure.
Chair?
Sorry, okie doke. So next in the order of people I have on my screen would be Godfrey.
So 2 for me would be youth voice, really capturing a way to consistently solicit feedback and input from our youth, and allow and take advantage of opportunities that we have in place to give them voice, choice, and be part of the process as much as possible. One thing, you know, is one, I think, initiative, you know, I think it's really important to like be mindful of wrapping ourselves around. And then, you know, really for this equity work, you know, that we publicize that we're engaging in, you know, for not only the goal of identifying proportionalities, but also really enhancing our capacity to be culturally responsive to the variation of the diversity of cultures we have in our schools. There's been, you know, consistent push and ask in different pockets of the community media around this a social justice curriculum or curriculum that's more continuously aligned, just more culturally appropriate, you know. And it's there's so many different cultures and so many different roadmaps. It's been the constant thread that's been voiced from the community. Different examples, but it's all been the same thing. Those are my 2. Youth voice.
Those are very important. I really like, you hit on something that research is really beginning to finally acknowledge. NYU put out an interesting report about helping youth build agency and understand how to be their own self-advocate, right? This idea of building agency and advocacy for children is unbelievably important, Godfrey, and I'm so glad you brought that up. Very, very important.
Well, I also want to like acknowledge, like when I just look at my experience working crises, opportunities to engage everyone, the most voice from people experiencing it, always lead to more richer outcomes, or at the least, you know, enhance our resiliency as a system, and even students, just to be able to weather it through. And with the technology capabilities that we've enhanced in the district, Ralph has data of how much we're connecting with kids consistently, you know, and just being able to leverage that type of contact in a more meaningful way is there's just very strong potential for what it can lead to. Agency being one of them.
Awesome, thank you.
That is awesome. And when it's my turn and I'll go last, please remind me, just to jog my memory of what I thought of when both of you were speaking, that I want to talk about it. Okie doke. I'm going to scroll over to the right here. We got Colin all the way to the right.
Well, I just want to say, I think it's, for me personally, it's difficult and nearly impossible to think about this question without the context of COVID. You know, I think ordinarily, I would say a priority right now, as we've gotten to the end of one strategic plan, is to, in a timely way, articulate our goals and how we're going to get there for the next 3 to 5 years. I don't know that we can do that when we don't really know exactly what instruction is going to look like this in the fall. And so that's the priority. The priority is to help us, navigate the next few months, which are going to be extremely difficult. I think there are things that will be heightened because of this, as Heidi mentioned. Under normal circumstances, it's so important to prioritize communication, open and clear communication, especially now with all these moving parts consistently changing. That's got to be like, we need to over communicate. People need to, I'm finding that there is a glut of information, and yet, as we all know, there are so many parents who are like, what's going on, right? So we need to over communicate. Clearly, the issue of learning loss over the summer, which is always an issue, is going to be really exacerbated, and I fear in some cases almost catastrophic. I think that's going to be a priority as we think about what instruction looks like, whether it's in-person, virtual, or some kind of flex model. And then that leads to a longer term priority, which is the question of equity in education. Clearly,
Colin, can I push you a little bit on equity and ask you to delineate between input and outcome? When you talk about equity, are you thinking about equitable distribution of resources, or are you thinking about and really wondering about the outcome, which is we've got a disparity on the outcome, or maybe it's a combination of the two? Can I push you a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's hard to separate the two. Clearly, I mean, we're it helps to be very outcome driven, data driven, but we have to map those outcomes to the kinds of equitable, like you said, equitable inputs that we're prioritizing in terms of resources, and even beyond outcomes. Thinking about curriculum equity. For all students, by the way, not for anybody who may be identified as diverse. I think we're in a moment right now in American history where there is a threshold of awareness about different parts of American history that have been glossed over. And I think the way that we address that, if we want to be intentional about it for the next generation, is to start with public education. And so I think curriculum equity with regards to all the different kinds of inclusive categories we talked about yesterday, not just race, but including gender, sexuality, to make that actually part of the way that we teach is going to be, I think, important for equity in the long term.
Excellent, thank you.
This is great. And I'm putting myself last because I know that the board members that go before me are going to say a lot of the things that are in my mind as well. So now we've got Barbara. Barbara?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
So I think the top priority for me is that we are really focusing on high quality learning and true excellence in education. So there are, Dr. Adamowski would always say, and I really agree with this, that when given the same resources, children in Norwalk do as well or better than our suburban children in our suburban communities neighboring us. And our current mission statement is to be the top urban school district in this state. And I would argue that there's not an urban, suburban, or rural way of becoming a lifelong learner or a curious person or somebody who can read, speak, and write well. And I would encourage us to push our expectations of our children and our staff higher in terms of the opportunities. And we're already seeing success in that area, with the Invention Convention and History Day. We've got national winners. It's incredible. So one of the, that was the lens through which I've approached the board work. And one of the barriers to that is really this equity and justice piece of it. Because until we solve for all issues related to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can't even really start to have that conversation about high level learning. And it's interesting because when I ran for the board, those issues weren't even fully on my radar, but now it's of the highest importance that not just the board, but that the entire community is working to solve those obstacles to learning. So that, I think, is my highest kind of dual priorities, that we make sure that we're being equitable and just in the distribution of resources, that we have certain expectations about baseline things that we will provide in all of our schools with parity. And even if they have a slightly different program or what have you, that we have an understanding amongst ourselves of what a school needs to have to succeed. And so anyway, there's a lot to that. I would also just lean gently into overall issues of wellness, which, the board has done a lot of work, and the previous board as well, on these issues. But I think especially through the lens of the global pandemic, the more we can promote healthy choices for our students and their families, the better the whole community will weather this crisis.
Okie doke. Diana, everybody got reorganized, but Diana is now in the upper right corner for me. So, oh, you're muted.
Got it. So for me, my biggest priority, being on the ground, talking to families, talking to students, I think for me is making sure that all families and students have a way to communicate with someone. Norwalk has different nationalities. Not everybody speaks English. And there is a lot of services that the schools can give the students that the students won't ask for themselves, and the parents don't know who to go to. It could be mental health. It could be about bullying. It could be just as simple as they need a tutor. They don't know they can go to the library. It's simple things, but it's also very complex things. And I think we need to work out some type of education for families, students, to make sure that they get the resources that they are allowed to have. That also comes down with the visibility in the community. I think we as the board members and the superintendent, if we are seen either at games or just walking the track at a school, things like that, the community will be more inclined to reach out. because there's a lot of undocumented families that are afraid to reach out because they're afraid that if they call in and ask a question or they ask for help, that someone's going to come knocking on their door and round them up. We need to try and fix that somehow. Help the families know that school is a safe zone. It's always been that school was always the safest place for children. And with so many changes recently, and then after Sandy Hook, the students that I have met with, and when I was campaigning, and Norwalk High and Brian McMahon students that came and asked, the first question was, what are we going to do to keep them safe in school? So those are all big topics that we need to discuss and try to figure out what we can do and how to reach the students, how to reach families. That for me is priority.
Out of curiosity, do you guys happen to have any sort of parent university or YouTube channel explaining what is available in terms of resources at the school district?
We don't have a parent university, but I think that that's a fantastic idea. Especially if it were short informational videos in a couple of languages.
Right, so that's what I'm beginning to see now, is that some parents, and I think Diana nailed it, depending on your own personal experience with school or, citizen status, right? That you're more willing to watch a short clip or video on your phone talking about an issue than you would going into a meeting, at least initially. And then once the level of trust gets there, there's certainly an opportunity for that to occur. So that may be something to think about. I still think we haven't heard from Mike, and then you, right, Sarah?
Yep, that's right. So Mike, you're up.
Good morning. So I think, as a lot of people touched on, COVID-19 obviously is a big factor. And what I would say in particular is we need to give people, one thing we really haven't done is give people a timeline of what to expect. People are trying to plan, people have got work commitments. This is both, all stakeholders, parents, staff. And so I know we had this big deadline today of submitting a plan to the state, but I think we need to, and some of the decisions aren't going to be ours, but the governor last night made some more pronouncements on what will count, what won't count, so we know it's a moving target, but I think we need to give people some guidance, because we are getting, I'm sure all of us are getting calls all the time about this, when's the decision going to be made? How's this? What's that? So I do think we need to give some kind of framework as to what people can expect, when decisions will be made, and what we're considering, and how at the end of the day, I think, as my understanding is, the state's going to make the ultimate decision. But, and is the board going to have input in this, or is this the superintendent's decision? Whatever, just whatever it is, I think we need to share that. So that, I think, is first hot button issue. Second hot button issue is an issue that's been around for a long time. I think Alex appreciates it, is the whole issue with facilities, and what are we going to do? And do we need to revise our plan that we've been developing? I had an idea I shared with her recently about buying a building that we could use for COVID. We could use as swing space, and eventually it could be the location for one of our schools. So, facilities still is, I think, a huge problem. We're maxed out, and it's really causing that much bigger of a problem in COVID-19. And then the last issue is, we all love to tout our diversity. That's what's so great about Norwalk. It's diverse. It's how we're different from other districts. The problem is, we aren't focusing on all groups equally. And we know we have some really struggling learners and poor learners, and that's where we're really investing a lot of our resources. But I think we don't want to lose our diversity. And if we dumb down the gifted and talented program, and we change some sports, and we do different things, and we alienate certain groups, you're going to start losing some of this diversity. And we're going to be, and as it is, look at what's happened to free and reduced lunch rates in the last 20 years. We've gone from 20% to 60%. And so we're losing our diversity very quickly. And if we don't take care of all groups, not just groups that need more help, but other groups that are have a big political power and help make sure we get these big budget increases and so forth, when the end, it's going to be detrimental to the school district. And this also ties in with, how are we going to need to, redistrict? How are we going to approach that? All those are, I think it's a really big hot button issue that is out there, and it's no one wants to touch it because it's politically very sensitive, particularly in the current environment. But ignoring it, the consequences of ignoring it, by the time you face up to it, it's going to be too late to fix. And that's it.
Interesting perspective. I will tell you, we're beginning to see an emergence of sort of how do you stabilize what some refer to as bright flight. This isn't about nationality, because in North Atlanta, again, one of the highest wealthy concentration of African Americans with money and influence and college going, et cetera. Once you lose that upper middle class who do have political acumen to help get the funding that we need and help advocate. But there's a huge resurgence now of that top quartile and what we're doing to keep them engaged in our schools. And it's not necessarily about race, but it is unfortunately one of those sort of sticky situations that school districts need to grapple with. And you do see some parents saying, hey, why are we always talking about the bottom 25%? What about my kid? He's in the middle and sort of lost. So I appreciate you bringing that point up. And Madam Chair, I think you're the last speaker on this part.
I am. And actually, this is a good segue into something that I've been thinking about. So I tend to get sort of philosophical when I think about questions like this. And I think what Mike was speaking about and what Colin was speaking about, and also you and Godfrey earlier in the discussion, all intersect for me, because there's two things. Number one is that as a school system, we are trying very hard to solve for problems that are systemic and much larger than us. So we're a school system, and there are, hundreds of years of inequitable decision-making and outcomes in America that, as a small urban school system, that's a heavy lift for us to try and solve American history. And that's what we're going to do, because that we've decided that we're going to work very hard in the best interests of all children. So I don't mean to complain about the work, but I do mean to say that we are operating within a system that's larger than us. And I think that the metrics by which we measure and assess our success as a system have been imposed on us. And they're not necessarily the metrics that we would choose for ourselves to assess our own success. And I think that those metrics influence all over the country, not just in Norwalk, educational practice, right? I'm talking about the idea of teaching to tests, right? Or teaching content that we know we're going to be assessed on, and we know that we're going to be rated as a district on. And I think, to your point about agency, when systems have these externally imposed metrics for success, as we all do, and the teachers and administrators and staff within the system know that they're going to be assessed relative to those metrics as well, that takes student agency away from their own learning, because they're not allowed to be self-directed in terms of what they pursue. Because if they do, then they might miss this other piece that's being assessed. So I think a very difficult, heavy responsibility for me, and I'm not going to speak for the whole board on this, but I have a feeling that many would agree, is to try and help people understand that the system as a whole, regardless of the intentions of the people within it, has some things baked into it that have unhealthy outcomes for kids. And we have to, as best we can, push back against assumptions that people have about what constitutes success, so that we're able to instill in children more agency over their own learning and their own joy of self-directedness in learning, and also to instill the things that we are going to need to have for those children to be actually successful in terms of the world as it will be. We're going to need people who are curious, people who are creative problem solvers, people who can collaborate with each other, people who know how to assess and vet information. So all of those skills that can be taught and can be, both explicitly and implicitly through how instruction is designed, are very difficult skills to instill when we're trying to work within the system that already exists, that has these assessment metrics that have been imposed on us. So that's not like something you can put on a bumper sticker as a hot button issue, but I think that it speaks to what you were talking about agency. I think it speaks to the systemic inequity that exists everywhere in America, but also here. And I think it's a hard thing to solve for, given that we also exist in a larger system as we do. For the bumper sticker stuff, things that are perennially hot button issues, and this is speaking to what Mike was talking about, is that we have a number of communities in Norwalk that sort of feel as if they're pitted against each other for resources or attention. We have a community of English language learners. We have our special education community, and I think because school budgets happen how they happen, it's unfortunate that all of the different communities in Norwalk feel as if they have to compete, rather than that we're a collaborative whole of a system and that a rising tide lifts all boats. But I think, unfortunately, historically, a rising tide doesn't lift all boats. So we have to somehow solve for that too, as best we can in our budget decisions and in the way that we have conversations with people about, how we're working. Did anybody get any information out of what I said? Was that too wordy? I apologize.
Very well put together. Your thoughts, clearly these are things that you've been thinking about for quite some time. I think it's interesting that, unlike a lot of districts, I love this about what I'm hearing. I mean, I didn't hear anyone say, I think it's important that graduation rates go up by 10% or reading rates go up by 10%. You guys are really, I think, in a good position to think differently about the way you approach the work and not be driven by these outside pressures of just these sort of metrics that somebody came up with in the back, of some political agenda that may or may not be there. I think those are all very important things. I think Dr. Estrella, listening to you all as a group talking about this really will help her inform and expedite her connection to the community. So even though, quote unquote, it wasn't maybe a bumper sticker piece, her understanding, how you're thinking about things, Sarah, as the chair, and each of the individual board members really will help her. Dr. Estrella, if you would just sort of give a little reaction to what you've heard and maybe even answer that same question that I posed to the board.
So for me, it was really interesting because one of the things that I feel resonated in the conversation of every member of the board, whether we're talking about the instructional aspect of a child versus the infrastructure in which the child is learning or engaging in, coupled with the resources necessary to do that, I feel that every board member in their own unique way spoke about the importance of setting up structures that provided equitable access for all students to have an appropriate and well-rounded education. I think it also resonated for me the piece around diversity, the importance diversity is for all members of the board and the constituents that they represent. But most importantly, how do we take the asset of being a diverse community and maximize the way that we leverage the success of the community as a result of that unique feature that we have. And design programming that ensures that all students within the organization at large have access to what they need. A lot of what Sarah articulated resonated a lot to me, because there is this quote that talks about a system produces the outcomes it's intended to produce. And thinking about what are some of the structures within our own system that are leading to some of the outcomes that we might not want to continue to see, and how do we work collectively to highlight what those structures are and define practices that will help address them. And I think that aligns well with the conversation around equity, because a lot of what we need to assess is, what do the people in the room bring to the table that are contributing to the system? Because we are the system. And as constituents of that system, what are the things that we need to do to address some of the concerns that have been highlighted? And I think I also concur with the idea that we are dealing with a historical perspective that has existed for decades, and it's not something that we're going to fix overnight. Although, like I think all members of the board articulated, it's something that we will do and we can do, but we have to be very thoughtful in terms of the approach that we take to move forward in doing that work. And I think I would conclude by saying that I see the different components in, I think, 3 essential buckets. The work that has to happen in teaching and learning, the work that has to happen in terms of infrastructure and processes, and then thirdly, how do we then umbrella all of these components that the board is discussing around what systems do we have to organize to set up equitable practices that will ensure that all of our children are successful, regardless of the multitude of languages they bring in that might not start off by being English, any specialized learning needs that they may require, any life experiences that they might bring to the table that might make them contribute a unique aspect of the world that might not be something that others bring to the table, but are essential to making them part of the whole. All of these pieces, I think, are going to be essential components that we need to prioritize to achieve the overarching focus that I hear the board talking about, ensuring that we, first of all, put children first. And in order to do that, we need to understand their families, support their families in doing that, but most importantly, continue to strive to maintain and excel in keeping Norwalk as one of the best city school systems in the country.
That's awesome. And I want to thank all of you for being honest and open and having the courage to share your thoughts and ideas. The more we do that, the better off we are as a governance team. COVID is interesting in the sense that it's forced us to do things that we're not comfortable with. So as an example, I may get a check in the mail and I need to go to the bank. I sign it and I give it to the clerk. And now I can't do that. The bank was closed. I was forced to learn to download the app, take a picture of the check and deposit it that way. I taught my 84-year-old parents how to use Zoom, how to get on Facebook, how to share, so it is forcing us all to think differently about the way we do things. And so one of the challenges as we transition into the next step, I'd like for you to be thinking about, think about all the teachers, like a typical 52-year-old kindergarten teacher who's been working diligently in your district for years, okay, has now been forced to learn Google Classroom or all of these apps, all of these things that, they really didn't want to learn. And so what did you learn as a school system about where teaching and learning could occur? could we design a future for kids where, in order to make up for all this lost time, 6, 7, 8 months, whatever it's going to wind up being, that we wind up investing differently in the way we use time, people, and money. And that some kids maybe ought to be in school 12 months a year, and that school looks slightly different for some than others. So I challenge you as you begin thinking about the next phase of the evolution, the next chapter in Norwalk. I think you have a unique opportunity with a new superintendent to rethink your vision, your mission, your core beliefs and values, establish what your theory of action is, and create a strategic plan that's coherent. And what I want to talk with you about next is, okay, great, let's say we do all that. What happens next? How do we get, a series of accountability metrics for the superintendent that are aligned to those things? You'd be surprised at what some of the evaluation systems are that I've seen. One of the superintendents I was working with in Louisiana, one of the things she was judged on is how she dressed and how she appeared in the community. I was surprised it was even on there. But that was important to that district. Clearly, that's an old evaluation system. I had a chance to look at what your evaluation system looks like for your previous superintendent, and I think a lot of the elements of it are strong. And I wanted to talk with you a little bit about evaluations in general at this point. We have a hard stop at 11:30. We're going to take an hour break for lunch. And I think Dr. Estrella had mentioned yesterday what the next 2 phases of this afternoon look like. So with your permission, Madam Chair, I'm going to go ahead and get started on this next phase.
Sure.
Awesome. So just to get a sense of what evaluation looks like, many evaluations by boards are based on emotion and feelings. Superintendent evaluation process has little to do with job performance. Unfortunately, the majority of superintendents still find evaluation process not helpful and not detailed. And I'm going to talk with you a little bit about some recommendations that we'll make. And there's no perfect superintendent evaluation policy or practice that exists. We've got to understand that we got to get as close to good as possible, but not letting good get in the way of doing nothing. The best way for boards to approach the topic of superintendent evaluation, quite frankly, is thinking about the system at like sort of as a whole. Unfortunately, we wind up sometimes seeing evaluations go sideways because of personalities. And we got to do a good job establishing what a good evaluation looks like early while Alex is onboarding and getting to learn the community. When the board defines the organizational success, then we need to be thinking about, how we judge that performance. So for example, the superintendent goes out, has a good, strong listening and learning process. She understands the board's big ideas, etc. She comes back to the school board and says, look, I believe, again, remember Dr. Gorman showed that little thing where she's allowed to come up to your section for a little bit, share some thoughts and ideas, and then go back below the line under the management line. And she may say, look, I've studied what this district has done well, and these are 3 or 4 big goals I'd like the board to consider. And then it's your job as a school board to decide, are they audacious enough? Are they achievable? Or maybe they're too audacious. So some of the things that matter as you begin thinking about evaluation is the size of the district. Is there a lot of conflict on a school board about what priorities might be? Or is it a board that leans more towards solidarity in terms of, look, we may not always agree on how to get things done, but we certainly agree on these big ideas. And as I've watched you all and listened to you and watched some of your old school board meetings, I think you lean further to the solidarity than you do as a high conflict board, but certainly that's something for you all to think about. We know that this board is elected in some cases, under bad situations like in Providence, Rhode Island right now, it's an appointed board. And the superintendent's role, we've clarified, we've talked about the press, we've had an opportunity to think about and contemplate past history and practice and state law. These are typically the kinds of things that you ought to see in a school superintendent's evaluation. This is straight out of the National School Board Association's group, and that is typically student learning at the top, which is outcome-based, leadership and professionalism. Earlier, we were talking, without really saying it, but about school climate. If parents and teachers and the local community has a very strong school climate, they won't call you and ask you to help with the problem because the school's made it such that parents feel welcome to come in and say, I'm not happy, and the principal and the teachers solve that problem. So this could be something, because I heard a lot about constituents' concerns and complaints. I almost wonder if, as you dig deeper, is there an issue with school climate that might need to be addressed where it feels easier in some communities to lodge a concern or complaint versus others. Financial management. I think your CFO would agree that this is a top priority as well. We want to make sure that we're meeting all the local, state, and national guidelines for financial management. District management is the superintendent, thinking differently about the way she's organized the team. Maybe after a strategic plan is developed, she may need to go back and take a look at how the team is organized and make sure that the resources are in the right place. And this is in no particular order. In this district, community and constituent relations may actually wind up being a little higher on the totem pole for you, based on what I've heard you say. And then, of course, the most important one is board superintendent relations. Dr. Gorman often says he doesn't know a superintendent who lost their job because they couldn't move the needle on academic success. Most superintendents lose their job because they can't figure out a way to work with their community and their board. Period. End of discussion. I've seen the most talented academic inclined superintendents in this country lose their job because they're just not a good team player and they don't want to work with the governance group. So basic models of evaluation. There's a couple of ways that people look at this, and in some cases, a blend of the three. The sort of big idea of global judgment, we're going to walk through these rather quickly. Criteria judgment, and then judgment based solely on data. So I'm going to walk you through each one of these. The global judgment methods are sort of narrative in nature. The evaluation is facilitated. There's general discussions about performance. We may wind up getting stakeholder evaluation or input. The superintendent would submit to the school board a self-evaluation. So Alex would say, hey, board, this is sort of where I see myself at the mid-year or at the end of the year. And then usually a summarized narrative of some sort where we would write out, these are some areas of strength, and then here's some areas that we'd like to see Dr. Estrella continue to grow. On the criteria judgment, this winds up becoming a little more black and white. Checklist rating form, management by objective. I've seen in some cases, I'm certainly not suggesting this, but there was somewhere upwards of 150 things that were being looked at by the school board in this gigantic dashboard, each broken up by third grade reading, math, science, etc. I'm certainly not advocating that, but I have seen that. And then rating on listings of duties or responsibilities. So if you were to say these are the 10 things that we think Dr. Estrella should do, and then each one of those would be individually rated. Data judgment methods, these are indicators of success. I would call these sort of like lagging indicators. In some cases at the mid-year term, Dr. Estrella could bring to you what others refer to as sort of leading indicators, which is where we are on formative assessments, where we are on data before the end of the school year comes to fruition. So why do people have, well, here's what we'll say. When there are strong evaluation systems where there's a clear link between the strategic plan, Dr. Estrella's evaluation, and the evaluation of each of her direct reports, right? Because the reality is her evaluation is the evaluation of the staff that's on this call with us today. because in the finance section, Tom, who's the lead in that area, is the individual who is primarily responsible for being the expert in that area. It's Dr. Estrella's responsibility to hold Tom accountable, to check in with him, to make sure he has the resources he needs to do the job that he's been asked to do. Just like Frank and Javier and others, Brenda, who are on the call today. Each of them are experts in their area, and Dr. Estrella should have the responsibility of holding them accountable and making sure that there's alignment in the work. There needs to be a strategic process. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. We need to agree as a group on what those sort of big criteria look like. Although I will say, looking at the current evaluation system that I saw that Dr. Estrella sent me, I feel like you guys are in a much better position than most school districts that I've seen. And then here's a discussion that I'd like to just stop and pause for a moment and ask the board for a little bit of feedback about the board's self-appraisal. Dr. Gorman led you all on a quick discussion the other day on a check-in about how you think you're doing. And Madam Chair, I'd like to just stop here for a moment and give you all an opportunity to respond to this board appraisal, and then we're going to move on to the next piece. You know, would the board consider going through an activity like we did with Dr. Gorman periodically with you, maybe annually, just like we would do an evaluation for Dr. Estrella?
For sure. So before I speak to that, I actually just wanted to say quickly, and this is sort of an extension of what I said at length before, but I think as we are coming up with the assessment rubric for Dr. Estrella, to your point about us having a possible climate issue, I think it's really important for us to understand that what we choose to measure informs the results that we get. And I think that part of the issue with us all getting a lot of constituent complaints, I mean, we're a pretty big district, so there's a lot of people, but I also think that the assessment rubric that we have now that we were using to measure Dr. Adamowski's performance influenced the results that we see. And that was one of the ancillary results, was that we heard a lot from people who were dissatisfied because we were measuring the success of the district relative to those goals. So I think as we choose what to measure, we need to be really mindful about that. And so I just feel that that's something to be very aware of. And then in terms of board self-assessment, I think the success of that hinges upon how self-aware we're all willing to be about it. But I think that it would be a good idea for us to periodically do that. Does anybody else have any thoughts about that?
I just put the screen up about what that might look like. Hopefully you can see it, so you can think, read that, and then maybe give us a little bit of feedback. Thank you.
Well, I think, from my perspective, it's important for me to know how much out of the norm is our self-appraisal from what the school district does. For example, if you walk into a auditorium meeting facilitated by the principal of the school, will you see a meeting taking place the same way our board meetings are projected? And that's an example of something to me that I think, should be clarified. Do we want to model what it is that we're expecting the district to carry out? And I don't quite know what that is, but I think it's worth the conversation because being able to have that conversation, I think will help layer how it looks for the valuation that create for Dr. Estrella. It's harder to support something that only 9 people are doing, out of 12,000, not counting in parents. And that's the kind of mindfulness I have when looking at, deciding and targeting the criterion for measurement. I don't know how different learning happens in the school setting versus how it happens at the board. I'm accustomed to receiving very pointed, conclusive reports before, executing a decision. And I don't know if the style it's presented is also consistent with the norms in the classroom. And when I think about, just hinging on the point around that was raised yesterday around like continuous learning and modeling, I'm not quite sure who we are modeling for. And it's to me an important thing that we have to really further delve out and be clear about.
I think that it would be really great for us to have this structure in place for accountability within ourselves. In the previous board, we would do these self-assessments and then there would be no discussion. It sort of went into a vacuum. So I think if we're doing them, then we should absolutely have discussion and refine our understandings amongst ourselves and communicate that also out to the community. As Godfrey pointed out, whatever we're doing as a board can't be in a vacuum. It has to be part of what we're trying to create as the climate for the whole district.
And one opportunity I think we have as well, I definitely think, a continuous self-assessment is vital to, any kind of self-improvement. So I think we as a board would be completely open to that. It also gives us an opportunity to learn to work even better with each other, and that's something that because these are positions with finite terms, we have turnover. And many of us are new on the board this term. And from what I've seen of us working together, and particularly the presence of Dr. Estrella here is a great example of that, is that the sum of what we're able to do together is much greater than the individual parts. And I think that can only be enhanced and improved and made better by these kinds of opportunities for self-assessment.
I don't know the local rule there. Are you all allowed to have closed session about the superintendent's performance? Like, one of the things we recommend is that quarterly. Okay, yes. Well, then I would recommend that quarterly. It doesn't need to be written out. It just needs to be a quick check-in and closed session quarterly. Some districts like to do, a formal mid-year check-in and then an end of year. I don't think, just like any of you at work would not want to, at the end of the year, get surprised by a concern. You'd want to know about that concern sooner so you can fix it. And that's no different for a superintendent. Having been one, the last thing I want to know is at the end of the year, one of my board members tells me, I don't like the way you've been handling this. And then I say, well, why is it the first time I've heard that? I can't fix it if you don't personally let me know that that's something stylistically that doesn't work for you. So you have an obligation as a board member, just like you'd want your boss to tell you, hey, you're doing a great job in these 4 areas, but I'd like to see you spend a little more time or a little more effort here. So unless I hear differently, I'm going to recommend that, you all have quarterly check-ins with the annual assessment, and we'll get to the details about the annual assessment in just a moment. Okay. So, why isn't this clicking? There we go. The bottom line, superintendent performance assessment, it should be a process, as I mentioned, and not necessarily an event. Superintendents and governance teams, this work is not easy. And so the more honest we are with one another, the better things are for us as a whole. Checklists and ratings are the least beneficial. The first year, here's one of the things we need to talk about that is a national issue. Many superintendents last year had no end of year data. My guess is Adamowski didn't have end of year data. I don't think Connecticut forced the kids to take end of year assessments. Most states didn't. which means there's a good chance you won't have end of year data this year either. I don't know that, depending on if a vaccine comes in, if we go back face to face. So we're going to have to talk about how we hold Dr. Estrella accountable for managing in, you know, like Pete said yesterday, a situation that occurs every 110 years. Hopefully it won't occur ever again. But this is an unprecedented time. Most school district boards typically do not evaluate a school superintendent on a big portion of their evaluation on outcomes that are academic. Typically the first year is a series of things that the board says are important. Could be, want you to do a major listening tour and give us a 90-day report on what you've learned. We'd like to see you establish a new, with us, a new vision, mission, core beliefs, values, strategic plan. These are all things that will set us up for the next 4 years after that first year is over, and then begin applying more objective outcomes for years 2, 3, 4, and 5, if that makes sense. That's typically what we see. It's hard to say, hey, look, you're in charge, you started, we're not even physically in a building, and we may not even have tests, but we're going to hold you accountable, for these objective outcomes.
Can I make a brief comment about that? Is that okay? In my own teaching practice and where I teach, and also here in the district, I am trying to help frame things as opportunities, even in the midst of this very disastrous, difficult pandemic. And I think because we don't have that data, we have a phenomenal opportunity with Alex coming in to decide what we want to measure and how we want to measure it, and let that determine how we proceed in a really robust, real way. And so it's an enormous opportunity. And I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's spot on. I just wanted to, because the next step here is that Dr. Estrella will provide you all a sample evaluation, okay, that she will share with you. And then you all will have to, in a meeting, decide that that's, in fact, what makes sense. But I want to hear a little bit more about the board. You get a little more reaction from the board about this issue of evaluation, this issue of the fact that many of the objective data points that we were accustomed to getting may not exist. And then number two, it's typical that school districts have more of a sort of their evaluation the first year for a superintendent is based on a series of actions and reports and strategy that needs to be built, and then later turning up the heat on objective measures. Can I get some general feedback on that?
Do you guys mind if I go first this time? So I think that you had a list of areas, climate and finances and those measurement areas, right? And I think that to me, not to speak for the board, teaching and learning and climate are inextricable, and we give a lot of lip service to creating lifelong learners. And I think we use that phrase so frequently that it sort of loses a bit of its meaning. But I think climate is crucial to creating actual lifelong learners. And I think that should be the explicit goal of our system as a whole. And so whatever assessment and evaluatory rubric we come up with, Dr. Estrella, together with and for you, the climate piece is going to be huge for me. So
I have to tell you something, guys, that it hurt my heart more than I ever could have imagined. We had partnered with NYU to do a study to determine how our teachers felt about work in Palm Beach County schools and how they felt about the kids. It was almost embarrassing to report out. 56% of teachers in Palm Beach County schools, and it's public, so I'm not sharing something with you that was, because I shared this out to the board. Almost 60% of the teachers in Palm Beach County schools didn't think that the kids they taught could learn. at the rate that they should. So when you start talking about how bias, and now these are people who knew that their surveys were anonymous, right? Because it was done with a third party. And if I can, I'll dig it up and see if I can send it to Dr. Estrella, because there was a lot of lessons learned for me about the work that needed to occur about people's mindset, climates in schools, and how to begin getting at that cultural competency that Godfrey earlier reported on. And rather than blame individuals for that, we just need to be honest and sift through it. So there's something there about whether or not people in classrooms, and I'm certainly not saying that that's the same finding you'd have in Connecticut. I'm just telling you that's what I found in Palm Beach. But in general, the way people approach their kids, right? Do they really believe? I mean, part of this is a kid feeling like they're completely safe and loved, and that the person who's nurturing and developing them believes that they can be the best version of themselves. So I just wanted to add that on there. I'm going to make myself a note to see if I can grab that for you. So yes, I think school climate and this whole issue is important. Any other thoughts from the board in general about evaluation?
Going once?
Were you all satisfied with the process that you had before, the tool that you had before? Would you be open to it being slightly different? If Dr. Estrella, brings something forward, again, knowing that year one, it's a little different. And then again, year 2, 3, and 4, you begin to tighten the screws, if you will, on the metrics that are important, like closing the gap, et cetera, et cetera.
I would be very open to revising it. And I think that the lens that we used determined what we saw. So I think in our revisions, we need to be very mindful of that piece. And I know I'm hammering and harping on that, but I feel strongly about it.
I think there's always sometimes a better way of doing things. And I think if we look at that lens and we look at that closely, we can always improve the processes that we have currently. So I think we should be open to changes if needed. I don't think there's a negative side to that.
I agree.
Okay, so what I'd like to do here is ask Dr. Estrella, you've heard the governance team talk a little bit about evaluation in general. We've talked about the different types of evaluations that are out there and how boards may approach it. Is there anything that I've shared or that the board has shared that you'd like to comment on before we go to the very last portion of our discussion today, which is just going to be general topics for future board discussions?
No, I think the points that are articulated are in alignment with what I believe. I think it's like Madam Chair articulated, it's going to be really important to think about what those metrics are, how we're engaging in the evaluation process, because I think a lot of how I'm evaluating is going to evaluate it will speak to the belief of the system at large, right? Because I'm pretty sure that metrics that are set to determine the success of the work that I'm going to collectively do with the team is directly correlated with the belief systems or the beliefs in general of individual board members in the council. And how does that resonate to the bigger scope of the vision we're hoping to accomplish for the district at large? Especially when we talk about accountability and what do we mean by accountability? I believe that accountability is not just the state metrics, that it's a more complex metrics to ensure children's success. And there are a lot of metrics that are not evaluated that are really important for the success of a child that we have to look into, and I have no issues being held accountable to. So I'm really looking forward to kind of redesigning what the scope of the evaluation looks like, because it will help shape the belief systems within the system at large.
I'm going to repeat what you just said, because I think it's so awesome that you said it, that a lot of the metrics that aren't evaluated are things that hugely contribute to the success of a child. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind.
Excellent. I really appreciate everybody leaning in this morning. You guys have done a fantastic job. And I know you have a long day still ahead. I do want to push you just a little bit. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about sort of what Alex still, sort of owes you all, and make sure we don't miss anything before we go to the last part, which is just general sort of what folks want us to be thinking about and talking about in the near future. We need to go back as well. Alex and the team need to go back and look at the communications piece in terms of a process for constituent services, ensuring that we put something together in front of the board and say, guys, this is how we'd like to move forward, and just get a quick thumbs up on that process. Dr. Estrella and the team need to put together some of the big ideas in terms of the board's priorities, maybe in a one-pager, so that she can have that handy as she continues her entry plan and begins to create some of the big buckets for a potential strategic plan. And then lastly, on the superintendent's evaluation, Dr. Estrella and the team need to put their heads together on what might be a fair and equitable first year evaluation, particularly given the COVID crisis. Are there any other deliverables on that we've missed before we move to the last and final part?
Does everyone feel that's complete? Okay.
Awesome. Okay, so the last piece is, this sort of, how we bring items, how Dr. Estrella and the team bring items to the board, and the idea that are there certain things that need to be brought to the board in terms of reports, in terms of the cadence. Typically what you see is, Tom, who's the expert in the finance and business office, he's got a cadence of when budgets need to be built. Those tend to be pretty standard, and I tend to see that being played out best in other districts around the country. Some places that we struggle with, does the board feel like, are they getting an annual look under the hood at special education? Are they getting a look under the hood on English language learners, or how different diversity, so for example, I think it was Colin earlier who had mentioned something about, have we looked at our curriculum and content recently to make sure that we're not brushing over certain elements of our history that kids should be taking a look at, right? Or do we have culturally sort of reflective textbooks and materials and activities for kids? I've seen some unbelievable things that districts have done. Down here in Palm Beach, we have a huge Guatemalan community. And what we've done to empower the Guatemalan community, the children, and rather than feel ashamed of who they are and their culture, we completely flipped it. We do all these beautiful activities for kids, and they take a lot of pride in what they do, and they feel very comfortable to share that. We do the same thing with our Haitian community and others. And it shouldn't just be in the month of, Black History Month, or, Latin American month, or whatever the months are. It should be something that's embedded within the way you do business. So those are the kinds of things that, we need to be thinking about now as a governance team. What kinds of reports and ideas should be brought to the board periodically so you can do your job, which is oversight. The easy oversight is the finance side. Typically your HR reports are pretty, front and center. What are our vacancies? How are we approaching that? Are there any things that you've not had a chance to look under the hood at that you feel like are important? That you haven't seen?
Oh, Barbara, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I think that a link that would strengthen our district is if we had regular presentations from the school building and the SGC regarding the school improvement plans in each building, and also regular interaction with them regarding their budget and their facility needs. I brought that up yesterday as well. that if we provide a structure that is lasting and written by which those communities can communicate their challenges and successes and needs, it would help make that process transparent for the community so that they understand our prioritization and decision-making process and feel that things are truly equitable. So I think that's something that I feel like we've started edging towards that this year, but the more we can put permanent structures in place that the district can use ongoingly, the better.
Dr. Strayer, do you need more clarity on that? I'm not sure.
So
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So if I hear what Barbara is saying, I think referring to having a clear system of accountability where people are able to provide the public an update at the school level in terms of the goals and priorities that I'm assuming will be or are aligned to the district overall goals and priorities, and provide an update of how that experience or the progress of the work is taking place at the school level in alignment to the overarching focus of the district, if I understand it correctly.
Exactly.
If I can add on to that though, as well, just going back to the school governance councils, I mean, it's very productive when we have that end of the year meeting, which we recently had, and we have breakout groups and very, very productive. But if I could suggest, and I think I might have done this before, but have it more frequently. Instead of that once a year, it could be quarterly. Minimal should be twice a year. It's like in any evaluation, it's not necessarily an evaluation, but it's just to hear feedback. What's working well, what's not working well, what do we need to tweak? So we don't want to wait until the end of the year to do that. We want to do something like that more frequently. I think it would be more productive, as I mentioned, but then we can hear concerns versus waiting on that.
Exactly. I think that sometimes, when we wait till the end of the year to have that conversation, we've already missed the budget cycle, for instance. So by putting in a structure for SGCs to have access to us and share their concerns in November, for instance, so they have September and October to meet, walk their building, discuss their concerns. They communicated to us in November so that we can include it in our budgeting thinking. And then we can have the additional one in the spring where we can sort of review how it all played out during the rest of the school year and the budget process and start thinking about best practices for the next year.
Yeah, and I think even when we had, some of us were at the high school level, middle school, elementary, we can kind of switch that up because I think we're looking at all different levels as a board and working with our school governance councils work more efficiently and more frequently. So again, as Barbara mentioned, November could be before that at the end. I'm thinking minimum at least 2 times a year, if not 3.
If I can pivot a little bit, I think that we have our annual climate survey that goes out to families, and I think there's 2 issues with it, and there's no perfect instrument to assess that, but I think social trust in the anonymity of information is not as high as I would like it to be, and so sometimes people don't participate, and I don't feel like we have as complete a picture as we could. And I also think that we could be individuating that survey a little bit more. I think it's wonderful that we have it, and I think that we can make it better to get more information that we can use. Does anybody else have anything?
Can I just go? Barbara.
Oh, sorry. Go.
I was just gonna go back.
Go, please. I'm sorry.
Alex, go.
I was just gonna go back to the piece around the SGC and make a suggestion to the board. in my previous experiences, one of the things I would do is invite the principal and their cabinet, in that case, SLT there, SGC here, and we could make them part of some of the superintendent reports or at some of the workshops where there's alignment, have them provide like 3 to 5 minute kind of update on the work that they're doing. And if we strategize, we can have all 21 schools in a cycle come to our board, well, your board meetings, where they can come and provide updates and reports in like small snippets. And like you said, maybe formalize more of a quarterly conversation at a larger scale. But at least people are having an opportunity to provide updates in sound bites versus having to do a big robust piece like Heidi, I think, articulated at the end of the year. It might be helpful for the community at large to see how all of the pieces are interconnected to the larger vision of the district and the individual needs and focus of the schools. Just something to put at the table for people to consider.
The other report that might be useful, just, you know, from a finance perspective, we have the overarching, you know, monthly update as to where we stand and how well we're sticking to our budget. But I think sometimes when we get the transfers, the explanation in the side is not thorough enough for the public or the board to fully understand what's happening and what's changed from what our original plan was to whatever the new plan is. And so I think especially this really comes up for me, especially in the area of facilities, that if we could have a regular quarterly report on how we've been utilizing our repair and maintenance dollars, so that we really are aware of how that's playing out. And then that also, shoot, I lost my train of thought. The philanthropy piece, we had, you know, for the first time since I've been on the board, a report on the status of our philanthropy. And that was very instructive and helpful to the board to understand. But I'm wondering if that could also be a quarterly or at least semi-annual thing, that we just are updated on the projects that we're working on with outside funders, even if they're anonymous or what have you, that's fine, just that we know that it's, you know, work is being done in that area.
And I wanted to just reiterate what a couple people had brought up before about making it a sort of a streamlined process, so there's not more work for staff, but the information is just available using technology or platforms that I'm sure exist or are being developed right now. So what do we think?
Dr. Estrella or Tom, do you want to react to that, or do you guys want me to talk about that a little bit?
I think that we need to sit down and really talk about what are the components that we want to see on a regular basis. How does it interconnect with other communication that will be coming out? Ensure that we're not duplicating communication streams, but also we're not overwhelming the system given the current capacity of the system. So once I have to sit down and review the different pieces that people have articulated they would like to see more of, and work with the cabinet in identifying what's already in place and what are the new structures that we're incorporating. Because even when we were talking about the piece of streamlining communication for community member concerns and ideas, like almost like a suggestion box, that requires reshuffling of personnel so that we can have consistency in messaging and data collection. So for that, this additional piece, it's also going to require thoughtfully thinking about the impact of the communications at large. Can we embed it so that we don't become duplicitous in terms of what we're doing? So it's going to require more thought.
Right. So it sounds like you and Mr. Hamilton will probably have to have some more discussion about what that looks like and see if there's an opportunity to provide that level of transparency.
Correct.
But without overwhelming sort of the system or whatever.
And already we're doing a piece of that, Robert, around the weekly reports where Mr. Hamilton is providing, as well as every cabinet member, an update of the work. What we could potentially do is not only provide that update to the board, but a larger constituency of the community, so that they are also aware of some of the updates around the work that's happening. For instance, informing principals and other stakeholders with that this information brings value to.
Excellent. Well, Madam Chair, I think we are as close to convening, finishing our meeting today. Unless there's any sort of closing statement you would like to make, that Superintendent would like to make, or any other board member. I know you've got a little bit of time before your next session, but wanted to leave the last few minutes for any closing thoughts from the team.
I am very glad that we've been able to have such a deep and detailed and thoughtful discussion about all of these things. And I am heartened to have heard when you were asking the question and we all gave our different answers about what we thought the issues that were pressing were. It really did seem like the 9 of us were describing the same elephant from our different points of view. And I found that heartening, and I'm glad about that. Alex, do you have any final thoughts?
I just wanted to thank everyone for being so thoughtful in the process of yesterday and today's engagement. Also, thank you for your patience as we dealt with some of the technological difficulties. Experiencing a new room, it just kind of speaks to some of the things that teachers will also have to embrace as they learn the new reality of things, right? COVID has taken us to a place where it's pushed us to think about the work in a very different way, especially for those folks, I think somebody mentioned earlier, that are not digital natives like our children are. But it also gives us some insight and opportunity to really better connect with the children we're serving and the future that they are prepping to be part of. But also it allowed us to really kind of start embracing one another in the work and getting to know each other better in terms of the different perspectives we bring to the table. But it's clear to me that we all have one focus, and that is children first. So that was very inspiring to hear and very uplifting. So thank you everyone for all the great work thus far. And I think the rest of the afternoon is also going to bring a lot of fruitful conversation that will continue to help us refine the work that we need to do forward, especially when we talk about equity across the system.
Thank you. Does anyone else feel like they have a final comment they'd like to make, or should we all get up and go stretch and, that kind of thing? This has been Radio Board of Education.
It's been a real pleasure having an opportunity to work with you. I look forward to continuing any discussions in the future. You've got a really good, strong team there. I've had a chance to already begin working with the cabinet members there, and they too share the same energy and passion I think I heard today from the board. So looking forward to it. Have a wonderful afternoon. Stay safe. We'll talk soon, okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So are we adjourning and then reconvening? Okay.
What time should we, as soon as we can get there, essentially, or?
So lunch is ready.